There is a version of the Ed Sullivan Show that most people have never seen. Not because the footage was lost or destroyed or locked in an archive somewhere waiting to be rediscovered, but because the version most people know, the polished, professional, carefully produced television event that America watched every Sunday night in its living rooms, was only part of what happened. The other part happened in the hallways and the dressing rooms and the rehearsal spaces of CBS Studio 50 on Broadway in New York City, in the hours before the cameras went live. And what happened in those hours, on the night that Marvin Gaye appeared on the most important television program in America, was something that nobody planned and nobody forgot. It was 1964. Marvin Gaye was 25 years old. He had been at Motown for 3 years. He had hits, not the kind of hits that would define his legacy, not What's Going On, or Let's Get It On, or the records that would eventually establish him as one of the most important artists of his generation, but real hits, Pride and Joy, Can I Get a Witness, Stubborn Kind of Fellow. Records that were selling, that were on the radio, that were making Gordy happy and making the Motown machine run faster. He had been booked for the Ed Sullivan Show. This was not a small thing. In 1964, the Ed Sullivan Show was the most powerful platform in American entertainment. It was where careers were made and where America decided, collectively and simultaneously, who was worth paying attention to. When the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan in February of 1964, 73 million people watched. 73 million. More than a third of the entire population of the United States gathered around television sets in living rooms from Maine to California, watching 4 young men from Liverpool play music on a stage in New York. To appear on Ed Sullivan was to be introduced to America, to the whole America. Not just to the black audience that had been buying Marvin's records and filling the theaters on the Chitlin circuit where he had been building his reputation, but to the white America that ran the mainstream, that controlled the radio stations and the magazine covers and the television programs that decided which artists crossed over from the black market into the larger commercial landscape where the real money and the lasting fame resided. Gordy understood this completely. He had been building Motown from the beginning around the idea of crossover, around the conviction that black music could reach white audiences if it was presented correctly. If the artists were polished and professional and positioned in ways that made white radio programmers and white television bookers comfortable. He had invested heavily in artist development, in the finishing school that Motown ran to teach its artists how to move, how to speak in interviews, how to present themselves in the mainstream contexts that were not always welcoming to young black performers regardless of their talent. Marvin had been through this development process. He had absorbed what it required and had produced a version of himself that was capable of navigating the mainstream, that was smooth and charming and professionally ready for the kind of exposure that Ed Sullivan represented. He was, on the surface, exactly what Gordy needed him to be for this moment, on the surface. Underneath the surface, Marvin Gaye in 1964 was a man in the middle of several simultaneous tensions that the polished exterior was only partly concealing. His marriage to Gordy Gaye, which had begun 2 years earlier, and which had made him the label head's brother-in-law, and complicated every professional relationship he had at Motown, was already showing the strains that would eventually pull it apart. He was making music that the machine needed him to make while simultaneously feeling the pull of music he actually wanted to make. The jazz records and the standards albums and the more personal, more artistically ambitious material that Gordy was not interested in and that the Motown formula did not accommodate. He was also, at 25, simply young in ways that professionalism could dress up, but could not fully contain. He was impulsive. He was opinionated. He was, when the situation required him to perform deference to people whose authority he did not fully respect, capable of a very controlled and very dangerous kind of resistance. Ed Sullivan was a man whose authority Marvin Gaye did not fully respect. Ed Sullivan had been hosting his variety show since 1948. He was 62 years old in 1964. A former newspaper columnist who had stumbled into television and discovered that he had a gift not for performing, which he did badly, but for assembling talent and for having the specific kind of taste that could identify what America was about to want before America had finished deciding that it wanted it. He was not warm. He was not charming in any conventional sense. He was formal and sometimes rigid and occasionally condescending in the way of men of his generation. And his background when confronted with performers whose cultural world was different from his own. He was also enormously powerful. And power, in Marvin Gaye's experience, had a way of wearing a face that reminded him of people he had reasons to distrust. The rehearsal happened in the afternoon, hours before the live broadcast. This was standard procedure. Every act that appeared on the Sullivan show went through a rehearsal in which the technical requirements were established. The camera positions were set, the timing was confirmed, and the performers had the opportunity to work through any issues in the performance before millions of people were watching. Marvin arrived for the rehearsal with his band. He was dressed well, as he always was, in the way that Gordy had taught Motown artists to dress, with a care and a precision that communicated to the mainstream audience that these were serious professionals worthy of their attention. He was courteous to the stage crew, friendly with the other performers who were backstage preparing for their own segments. Then he met Ed Sullivan. The accounts of what happened between them in the rehearsal have been filtered through memory and retelling in ways that make precision difficult. What is consistent across the accounts is this: Sullivan gave Marvin a directive about the performance, not a suggestion, a directive. He told Marvin how he wanted the song performed, with specific instructions about movement and staging that reflected Sullivan's very particular ideas about how black performers should present themselves on his stage, ideas that had been formed over 16 years of hosting, and that had not kept pace with the changes happening in the culture around him. Marvin listened to the directive. He was quiet while Sullivan spoke. He nodded in the way that suggested compliance without actually committing to it. Then he went back to his position and performed the rehearsal his way. Sullivan noted. He stopped the rehearsal. He repeated the directive, this time more explicitly, with the kind of emphasis that powerful men use when they want to make clear that the first statement was not a request. Marvin was quiet again. He nodded again. The rehearsal continued. Marvin performed it his way again. The tension that built in that studio over the following hours was the specific, crackling, dangerous tension of two men who have each decided that they are right, and that the other one is going to be the one to back down. Sullivan had the power of the platform. He had the power of the signature, the authority to pull an act from the show with a word to his producers. He had the power of a man who had been doing this for 16 years and who was accustomed to performers, understanding that appearing on his show was a privilege that required accommodation of his preferences. Marvin had the power of the voice. He had the power of the music, which was real and which Sullivan needed for his show, and which could not be separated from the person producing it without losing the thing that made it worth having. He also had the power of a man who had grown up in a house where authority was exercised without justice, where compliance was demanded and resistance was punished, and who had learned very early that some authorities were not worth the full submission they demanded. The negotiation between these two powers happened in the hours between rehearsal and broadcast in ways that the people who were backstage that day have described as uncomfortable and occasionally alarming. Marvin's road manager was involved. Gordy was reached by phone. Compromises were discussed. The specific details of what was agreed and what was not agreed, and what Marvin ultimately performed when the cameras went live vary, depending on who is telling the story. What is consistent is this: when the cameras went live and the red light came on and Ed Sullivan introduced Marvin Gaye to the largest television audience in America, Marvin Gaye walked to the microphone and performed. He performed brilliantly. That much is beyond dispute. The footage exists. The voice that comes through the television broadcast of that evening is the voice of a man who is completely present in the music, who is giving the performance everything it requires, who is communicating something to the people watching at home that goes beyond the specific notes of the specific song and reaches something more fundamental, something about what the music is and what it means and where it comes from. Whether he performed exactly what Sullivan had asked for is a question that different witnesses answer differently. What the footage shows is a performance that has Marvin's specific quality, the quality that was already distinguishing him from other performers, even in these early commercial years. The quality of a man who is not performing at the audience, but performing through the audience towards something beyond them. Sullivan watched from the wings. His face, in the accounts of the people who watched him watching, was unreadable in the way of men who are recalculating something in real time. After the broadcast, there was a conversation. Again, the specific content of this conversation is not fully preserved in the public record. What is known is that Marvin left the building quickly, with his band, without the extended socializing that these appearances sometimes involved. What is also known is that Marvin Gaye appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show again, multiple times, which suggests that whatever happened in the hours between the rehearsal and the broadcast resolved itself, at least professionally, in a way that left the door open for future appearances. What did not resolve, and what the people who knew Marvin from this period say was clarified rather than created by the Sullivan experience, was his understanding of the terms on which mainstream success was available to a black artist in 1964. The terms were real. They had costs. They required accommodations that were sometimes minor and sometimes not minor at all. Accommodations of how you moved and what you said and how you presented yourself to people who had the power to give you access to the audience that access to required. Marvin understood this. He had understood it before the Sullivan Show. But the Sullivan Show made it concrete in a way that understanding in the abstract could not fully achieve. He had stood in that studio and felt the specific weight of what the mainstream required. Felt it in the conversation with Sullivan and in the hours of tension that followed, and in the negotiation over what a black man with an extraordinary voice was and was not permitted to do on the most watched television program in America. He accommodated what had to be accommodated. He delivered the performance. He appeared on the show again and again in the years that followed, because the platform was real, and the reach was real, and Gordy needed the crossover and Marvin needed what the crossover produced. But something had been confirmed. Something that would take another 7 years to fully surface in the music, but that was already present in him. Already growing, already moving toward the moment when accommodation would no longer be possible. When the gap between what the mainstream required and what the music actually needed to say would become too wide to bridge with professionalism and courteous nodding and performing your way through the afternoon rehearsal. What's going on was the moment when that gap became the music. When the accumulated weight of everything that had been accommodated and negotiated and managed finally became the subject rather than the obstacle. When Marvin Gaye stopped nodding and said what he had been trying to say since he was standing in CBS Studio 50, watching the red light come on and understanding exactly what the terms were. Ed Sullivan died in 1974. He did not live to hear What's Going On declared the greatest album ever made. He did not live to see the full arc of what Marvin Gaye became after the years of accommodation were finally over. But he saw the beginning. He saw the young man with the voice standing in his studio in 1964, nodding at the directives and then performing his own way. He saw, if he was paying the right kind of attention, the specific quality of resistance that was already present in Marvin Gaye, before the world had given him a platform large enough for resistance to matter. He may not have known what he was seeing. He was 62 years old, and he had been doing this for 16 years, and he had seen many performers come through his studio, and very few of them had become what Marvin Gaye became. But the people who were backstage that day knew. They saw two men in a room and they understood, watching it happen, that one of them was going to become something that the other one did not have a category for. Something that the mainstream platform would eventually be too small to contain, that the accommodation would eventually become impossible, that the nodding would eventually stop, and what would replace it would be music that made the whole question of who got to decide how a black man with a voice presented himself on television feel like exactly the small and temporary thing that it was. The cameras went live. Marvin walked to the microphone. He sang. That is what he always did. Whatever the negotiation required, whatever the accommodation cost, whatever happened in the hours before the red light came on, he walked to the microphone and he sang. And the singing was always the thing that mattered. The singing was always the part that could not be directed or managed or contained by any authority that the mainstream could produce. The singing was the part that was completely and only his. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of what it costs to sing your own way in rooms that are asking you to sing theirs, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who has ever had to decide how much of themselves to give to a room that does not fully deserve it. Leave a comment and tell us what Marvin Gaye's music means to you. And ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about the voices that refuse to be entirely contained. There is a particular kind of pressure that a live television broadcast creates that no other performance context fully replicates. The finality of it, the inability to go back, to correct, to adjust after the fact. When the red light comes on and the cameras are live and the signal is going out to 70 million living rooms simultaneously, everything that happens in the next 3 minutes is happening to all of those people at the same time, permanently, in a way that cannot be recalled or revised or explained away. Marvin Gaye understood this. He had performed live many times before the Sullivan Show. He had stood in front of audiences who could be read and responded to in real time, whose energy could be felt and used and turned back toward the music. He knew what a live performance required, and he was capable of delivering it with consistency and with the specific quality of presence that separated good performers from great ones. But television was different. Television took the performance and froze it, made it permanent, sent it into a context that the performer could not control. into living rooms where the music would compete with the dinner being made in the next room, and the children making noise, and the husband falling asleep in his chair. Where the performance would be received by people who were not there for Marvin Gaye specifically, who had turned on the television to watch a variety show and were receiving him as one element of a larger entertainment package. The Sullivan Show demanded that the performance work in all of these contexts simultaneously, that it reach the person who was paying full attention and the person who was half watching from the kitchen and the child who was doing homework on the floor, that it communicates something through a screen to people whose relationship to the music was mediated by the technology in ways that a live concert could not fully anticipate. Marvin had thought about this. The accounts of people who were close to him during this period describe a man who was extraordinarily aware of what different performance contexts required, and who had developed specific adjustments in his approach for each. The church required one thing, the nightclub required another. The recording studio required something different again, and television, he understood, required something that none of the others had trained him for. It required simplicity. The camera had a way of amplifying anything that was self-conscious or performed in the theatrical sense. Gestures that worked in a club, that communicated something real to an audience that could feel the energy of a room, looked different on screen. They looked like gestures. They called attention to themselves as performance rather than disappearing into the music. What worked on camera was what was true. The camera, for all its technical mediation, had a way of finding the authentic and transmitting it through the screen with remarkable fidelity. Audiences watching at home could not always name what they were seeing, could not always articulate what distinguished a performance that reached them from one that did not. But they felt it, they responded to it. This was the thing that Sullivan's directive was working against. Sullivan wanted the performance shaped according to his sense of what black performers should look like on his stage, which was a sense formed in another era, and which prioritized a kind of presentation that the camera and the audience did not actually need, and that Marvin, with his particular gifts, did not need to provide. What Marvin had was already exactly what the camera wanted. The authenticity was already there. The specific, unmediated quality of a man singing from inside the music, rather than from outside, it was already transmissible through the screen. What Sullivan was asking for was a layer of presentation over that authenticity that would have obscured rather than enhanced it, that would have replaced the real thing with a performance of the real thing. Marvin understood this. He could not have articulated it in exactly these terms in 1964. He was 25 years old, and he was navigating his first major television appearance and the theoretical vocabulary, for what he understood intuitively about the relationship between authenticity and the camera had not yet been developed. But he understood it in his body, in the specific way that performers understand things that cannot be fully taught, that can only be felt and acted on. He performed his way. The camera received it. The 70 million living rooms received it, and the directive became, in retrospect, irrelevant. This is the lesson of the Sullivan Show for Marvin Gaye's career, and it is a lesson that runs through everything that follows. The people who told him how to present himself were not always wrong about the specifics they were describing. Sullivan's experience with what television required was real and extensive and worth taking seriously, but they were wrong about Marvin. They were wrong because they were applying general principles to a specific case that those principles did not fully address. The general principle said that performers needed to shape themselves to the requirements of the platform. Marvin's specific case said that Marvin shaped the platform to himself, that the specific quality of what he had was unusual enough that the usual shaping worked in reverse, that the camera did not need him to adjust for it. It needed him to be fully himself so that it could do its job. This would be true for the rest of his career. Every attempt to contain him, to direct him, to manage the presentation into something that fit an existing category, ran up against the same problem. The category was always smaller than what Marvin actually was. The management always lost something in the managing. The direction always produced something less than what the undirected voice produced when it was given the room to be entirely itself. The Sullivan Show was the first time this was visible. The first time the gap between what the mainstream wanted and what Marvin had to offer became concrete in a way that could be observed and remembered. It would not be the last time, but it was the beginning of the long, difficult, ultimately triumphant story of a voice that could not be fully contained by any platform, or any directive or any authority that told it to be something other than exactly what it was. The red light came on. He walked to the microphone. He sang. Everything followed from that.